Now let's look at an aggregate feature that's referred to as design time data in Visual Studio. Basically what this is for Visual Studio to really light up and give you a lot of support in the designer for working with data binding, the designer is going to have to know what data you're working with. At a minimum, that includes what type of entities you're working with, so it knows about the properties and the type of those properties to facilitate some of the dialogues and things that you've seen in previous demos. In addition, if you have sample data available, it can render that in the design time environment. Having this information can help you out in a number of ways with the graphical design of your user interface. First off, in hooking up the code, you get better binding IntelliSense. In Visual Studio 2012, the binding properties show up when you're typing in the XAML editor, but you don't have much information about the actual data that you're working with. One new feature in Visual Studio 2013 is that anything that's wired up as a data context in the design time environment will show up in the IntelliSense list. And if you pick those, it's going to set those up to hook up the path property of the binding. In addition, you saw the properties binding window can populate with the properties on your current data context object or on other resource objects that you point to with the source binding. In order to do that, it has to know what those types are. In terms of the sample data, that can help out a lot with getting your UI laid out appropriately. By having that data there in the designer, you can visualize more what your controls are going to look like once they are populated with data. And that can help you decide on the sizing and positioning of those controls. Now, one important thing to realize is that your UI elements are live in the designer. And what I mean by that is the elements themselves are actually being constructed and loaded to render in the designer, just like they do at runtime. This means that anything you construct in the XAML is also live too. That means they're going to be constructed and will be invoked from the designer. So for example, if you're wiring up your view model to the data context property in the XAML, that's going to be constructed. And if in your constructor you try to call to a service or a database, that's not going to work out because you don't have a full execution context there. Specifically, you don't have any application configuration. And your host executable is actually Visual Studio, not your normal host executable that you're building. So things like database and service calls will generally fail. Calls out to certain frameworks may not work correctly, but basic construction of objects, setting of properties, and things like that should work just fine. Now, to start leveraging this design time data, you need to start using some framework features that are available. First off, there's a D namespace that you're going to pull into your XAML. You can see it has expression blend in the namespace name, and that's because that's where these features were originally introduced back in 2008. Next, you have certain properties that you can set on objects that are only available in the design time environment. So DDataContext is one that is similar to the normal data context property on an element, but if you set this on an element, it's only going to set the data context in the design time environment, and it will basically be ignored at runtime as if it wasn't there. But in the design time environment, whatever object you point this to is going to be available in the designer and can be used to render out things in bindings. And it's going to flow down the visual tree just like a normal data context does. Another property like this you can use is on a collection view source is the DDesignSource property. So this is the equivalent of the source property on a collection view source, which you normally point to whatever the collection is that is wrapping. DDesignSource just provides a design time collection to use. Next, there's the DDesignInstance markup extension. So this is a markup extension with curly braces that you can use on the right side of the assignment from something like DesignSource or data context. And what you do is you provided a type through an xtype markup extension, and it's basically saying, create me an instance of this object type for the design time environment so that the designer can reflect on it, find out about its properties and the types of those properties and so on, but it will basically just be an empty instance or default values for all the properties. Last, there's the DDesignData property, and this is one that you can point to a XAML file or an XML file that can be turned into an object model. And once that object model is created, if it has the same properties as you expect for your runtime objects, those can be rendered out through the bindings. So you can use DDesignData to set DDataContext or DDataSource, and instead of just getting the type information, you actually get a whole built-up object model with values for all the properties. So let's take a look at a demo of using all these features.